Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's DataBytes. We are going to get started in about 2 minutes because we know it takes a little while for everybody to sort of log on. But while we are waiting for everybody to do that log on, today our speaker is going to be talking sort of around the manifesto for data practices. And you can see the link up on the screen, and I'm also sharing it with you in the chat box. So it should only take about a minute or two to read. So while we wait for folks to log on, if you want to check that out, that would be great. And then we'll start in just a few minutes. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. I'll say welcome again to everybody to today's NCDS DataBytes Lunchtime webinar series. Today's speaker is Leonard Fishman, and he oversees business development and partnerships at Austin-based B Corp Data.World. Before joining Data.World, he was CEO and co-founder of two ventures. The first, Pledge for Good, was a social fundraising platform that he founded while completing his MBA, and that was acquired in 2012. More recently, he founded a big data company serving investment funds called Unique.io, which he ran for 3.5 years. Len has been a speaker at many events, including the White House Open Data Summit, the Open Data Science Conference East, the OECD's Global Science Forum, and many others. He earned an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and an undergraduate degree in economics from Duke University. Today's talk, which is titled Best Practices for Better Data Teamwork, will last about 35 to 40 minutes, and there'll be time for question and answer at the end. So as Len talks, please feel free to type general questions in the chat box. We'll hold them until the end, and then we'll share them out, and Len will address them. So thank you all for being here, and welcome, Len.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And yeah, I also want to add that I'm joined by my colleague, Patrick McGarry. Patrick really was the vision behind the manifesto that will constitute a lot of what today's webinar will be about. He is our Director of Community and joined us from Red Hat, where he held a very similar role. Thanks a ton for joining. This is definitely an area that we're very passionate about and think that substantial progress can be made within companies, the public sector, and academic research. To introduce Data.World, we're a productive, secure platform for modern data teamwork. And the problems that we're solving really relate to, first, data being hard to find, collaborators working in disconnected tool chains, and then third, data work being hard to understand, trust, and reproduce. And when we look at these three problems together, we think they underlie what the New York Times and Harvard Business Review and others have described as the janitorial aspects of data work that people are often spending 80% of their time on. And this impact that's so prevalent is like really serious. It leads to decisions being made from incomplete, inaccurate, or misunderstood data. Resources are wasted as colleagues undertake work that others have already completed. And in large part, there's just so much untapped potential in project outputs that reflect only the expertise of a small fraction of stakeholders involved. And at Data.World, what we try and do is bring together data practitioners, subject matter experts, and really all stakeholders by removing barriers to discovery, understanding, integration, and sharing around data, really with the objective of harnessing a team's collective brain power. When people use Data.World, all the context associated with data, whether that's a discussion, a data dictionary, an explanation of a newly engineered feature, code used to wrangle data, or a notebook used for analysis, is all preserved alongside data itself so that it's easy to understand what questions have been asked qualitatively and analytically of data. And we think this makes data more trustworthy, reproducible, and extensible. And the last two features of the platform that I think are really significant, unique, relate to social and integrations, where we're connected to tools ranging from Python to Tableau to Excel and many others, really with the objective of bringing together collaborators that otherwise would be working in disconnected tool chains. It's free to create an account on Data.World, and I'd encourage everyone on the webinar to check out the platform. So I hope that at this point you've read the manifesto for data practices. That's going to be really the main topic for the webinar. And before I go into detail about the manifesto itself, I want to emphasize that Data.World participated in the creation of the manifesto, but we were really only one of the voices that contributed to its creation. And I'll describe in more detail the objective of the manifesto, the values and principles that we think describe the most effective, ethical, and modern approach to data teamwork. Now, I wish that I could promise this webinar would be a panacea, and it would help you solve all the challenges your organization might be facing when it comes to collaborating with data. Instead, my hopes are that the presentation accomplishes two main things. First, I'll describe the principles in a framework that you can strive towards and that should help your organization make progress towards improving how it collaborates with data. And second, I'm going to go through concrete exercises that you can lead at your organization to surface these issues, to initiate a discussion around the state of affairs, and establish concrete goals to drive your organization forward. And with that in mind, I'm going to preempt a likely question. I will be sharing the slides, and included in the slides will be my speaker notes, which I think will really be important as you look to bring these exercises to your organization. So at its core, the manifesto emphasizes four pivotal values: inclusion, accountability, impact, and experimentation. And when we view these, we really view that to maximize the diversity, the connectivity, and accessibility of data projects, and also the people that participate and the outputs, is essential. We think continuously iterating and testing is equally important, and that participants in data projects should be behaving transparently. They should work to fix mistakes quickly, and everyone involved should hold ourselves and our output accountable. And then lastly, it really is important to prioritize projects with very well-defined goals, and actually from the onset to design them in order to achieve measurable and substantive outcomes. So consistent with the first value that I described on the previous slide, the community that came together to produce the manifesto emphasized diversity in many ways. The group had data leaders from multi-billion-dollar companies, from startups, from open source, government, nonprofits, academia. A few notable examples: the chief data officer of the city of Boston, the former chief data scientist from Ancestry.com, the data editor of the Associated Press, and a number of others. And then beyond the initial community that came together to look to describe this framework, the manifesto has actually been signed by over 1,400 individuals that, again, really take into account the emphasis around diversity, including the former US chief data scientist, DJ Patel, the principal data scientist from Booz Allen, Kirk Bourne, Trisha Wang from Harvard's Berkman Center. And if you're curious, you can actually see a list of all signatories on the manifesto website. And I hope some of you will consider signing and bringing this to your organization. In that end, these principles and the signatures and press coverage, they're really helpful to get the word out. But our intention isn't that people get excited about this for a narrow moment in time, because that would really be a missed opportunity. What we're really hoping to do is, starting with the manifesto, and then provide tools that let individuals actually take this and apply it within their organization and really strive towards completing it. And because really, in order for the manifesto to change things, it really needs to be just adopted. It really needs to be taken into practice. And, I'll say that, some of the exercises, they'll need to be polished. They may require alterations to fit within the context of your organization. So that's understandable. But please share feedback as you consider these, and also, more importantly, as you actually bring it to your organization. I'll give a reference to some of the inspiration. A lot of the ideas that we internalize come from IBM's Design Thinking Field Guide, from IDEO's method cards, and generally from design sprints. Now, when the community that prepared the manifesto came together, they described the data workflow as follows, and it had 7 steps from kickoff to delivery. And the exercises that I'll share today, they really focus on the kickoff phase. And we've chosen to do that because, in our opinion, this is the most critical of stages, and it really can strengthen the outcomes if at the onset the right stakeholders, questions, and goals are identified. And as I go through the exercises in more detail, one of the things that you'll note is, in particular, the values that will be described will emphasize inclusion and impact. So to set up the exercises, and this, again, may be one area you consider altering for your context, but ask participants to imagine that they work at a 1-year-old startup that's built an on-demand childcare services platform and has been tasked by the board to double revenue over the next year. And the first exercise is going to ask participants to break down the objective into components. And we'll ask, what information do you need to meet this objective? So participants can begin to frame these questions. And we'll also ask, what things could you try to get there? And again, that'll frame participants towards ideas. So participants will be thinking about questions and they'll be thinking about ideas. Participants will initially work independently, and they're asked to write down as many ideas and as many questions as they can on individual Post-its in 5 minutes. And really emphasize quantity, because these are just going to be starting points, and it's much better to have a wide range of ideas to synthesize and refine than a smaller number that fail to cover a full range of possibilities. And questions really can range from being exploratory to being very targeted, and ideas can range from being transformational to being much more tactical. Once individuals have finished this part of the project, they should convene in small, randomly assigned groups and begin to decide whether the questions and ideas are high impact or low impact. Low impact ideas or questions are ones that aren't likely to move the needle much towards the objective if they're pursued or answered. And it's really important to categorize as high or low, and because that'll help sort out the Post-its to kind of organize the team and lead towards prioritization. Then groups should look for connections between the ideas to identify themes from the group's thought. And the rationale to work independently combined with a random assignment of teams convened as a group really gets at the inclusion value. So while working independently, everyone has a fair opportunity to fully develop questions and ideas. Their unique perspective gets documented. And then when the group convenes and shares Post-its with ideas and questions, what's likely to become evident is the variety of questions and ideas that come forward based on individuals' experiences, priorities, and concerns will be reflected. You won't have a scenario where one voice is really dominant. And that also gets at the importance of the randomization. You really want to have groups that don't reflect colleagues that are very tightly aligned all of the time, but to be more representative of stakeholders that will work together. And the second value, impact, is very central to the group activity, simply in the separation of higher and lower impact questions and ideas. So next, and for the second exercise, individuals should break from their group and disambiguate high-impact Post-its as much as possible. And the objective is ultimately to reach shared definitions and clear questions in order to reduce friction and back and forth between stakeholders, and also increase the number of stakeholders who can benefit and contribute to the output, align around expected results. It was interesting, and when we led this workshop at the South by Southwest conference, one of the moderators shared a story that I think really captures the challenge of definitions that aren't shared within a group. And she was saying, working with her clients, that the acronym SQL was one that often would be a source of confusion, because for her, it was fundamental to think of that being defined as the query language. But for her clients, it often would be how they would use an acronym for sales qualified leads. So at this point, we've seen that it's very important to encourage participants to really be militant about eliminating ambiguous language, unnecessary words, so that their real intent shines through. Then participants should reconvene with their groups, the same groups they were in for exercise 1, to compare versions of the same questions. They should look for ways to combine them into a single, more powerful question. So in this example, person A interpreted perform best as being the lowest cost per acquisition, but person B took it to mean that the ads brought in users that spent the most money. So as a group, they found a way to combine the versions to identify the ad channels that provide the best balance between both definitions. And something to be aware of is, in some cases, the groups will simply agree that one version is clearer, and that's totally fine. And the rationale to work independently and reconvene as a group is very consistent with that from the first exercise. While in the first exercise we grouped similar ideas and questions, now we work to combine and synthesize more refined versions that reflect the team's best thinking. And a guiding principle during this step should be to most precisely define potential impact. So moving on to exercise 3, this revolves around practicing empathy by having participants think about the inner worlds of their colleagues. So for this independent portion, participants should list the internal stakeholders who would be impacted the most. I really want to emphasize the impacted the most by pursuing each individual high impact idea or the related questions. Occasionally, having an org chart can be handy so people can have something tangible to refer to. So in this case, just considering our fictional head of marketing, she hopes that new users won't be fly by night. She also wants to prove the value of marketing strategies that she's asking the company to invest in. But she also fears that there won't be more budget to make it happen, and she'll have to make tough cuts and tough choices. And then she also wants to understand whether users are recruiting their friends and family, and there's an element of a viral component. So again, participants should reconvene with their group and aggregate all of the stakeholder insights. Similar to previous exercise, they should try and combine related post-its to make them more powerful, and then to start rank ordering each stakeholder's hopes, fears, and questions. In exercises we've run, we've seen that using adjectives to help sort, such as highest hope or deepest fear or trickiest question, can be helpful. And a key characteristic of this exercise is thinking about inclusion, not only from the perspective of the parties immediately involved in the project, but also those who will be impacted by the results of the project, and really just thinking outside of an immediate working team. The fourth exercise and the final exercise that I'll talk through really aligns participants around high impact questions and ideas. And they have internal stakeholders, they've identified hopes and fears and questions, and now we're really going to think about what's the best way to transmit knowledge to these stakeholders in useful ways. And in exercise 4, we kind of view inclusion from a different lens. In this exercise, we acknowledge that to include different personas, we should be thoughtful about how we share data and analysis as well as results with them. Of course, for a data project to have an impact, the results need to be transmitted to different stakeholders in manners that are most appropriate for them. So the first part of the exercise is going to be individual again, and participants should choose a single stakeholder and a single high impact idea or question. So in this example, we'll continue describing the head of marketing, and we've chose the idea about doubling ad spend on the current mix of marketing channels over the next 12 months. from the previous exercise, we think that this stakeholder really cares about user retention. So participants should first fold a sheet of paper into 4 sections, and then in each quadrant, sketch or write or illustrate in a different way means of communicating this idea about ad spend and how that will affect retention. There's not any need to do analysis. It's thinking more along the lines of how the output would look to explore this idea could be presented. And then for each high impact idea or question and stakeholder pair should have its own page. Continuing the pattern of independent work to group reconvening will continue in exercise 4. And when participants regroup, they should go through all the ideas and then choose which representation works best for each idea or question for each of the stakeholders. And here we've seen prompts such as what are the shortcomings of each representation, or what do the stakeholders expect, are really good ways to drive conversation. Next, we should ask groups to draw 2 intersecting axes. One will be labeled impact and the other labeled effort. And then as a group, they should place the best representations from the exercise in the corresponding sections of the matrix. And this should give the group an additional lens through which they can evaluate possible approaches to meeting the overall objective. And as I mentioned, in order to have impact, inclusion isn't only critical at the start of the project, but also throughout and at the conclusion of the project. And when I described that the 4 exercises that we would emphasize today, like really focus on the kickoff, and it really is important to think about how the information will be presented at the delivery stage of the project up front so that the project can be undertaken in a manner to reach the desired outcome. So if you do test these exercises at your organization, please let us know how it goes. And if you have ideas for additional exercises, in particular about other stages of the data workflow, definitely please share them. And this is my contact information. You can find me on data.world as well. And I'd be really happy to answer any questions about the manifesto or the exercises or the general topic of data teamwork.
Okay, great. Thank you, Len. So everybody can feel free to ask questions in a number of ways. You can type your question in the chat window, and I think Len can see that window. Or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you, and you can ask your question that way also. Which, speaking of which, I see Shannon Keene asked a couple of questions. So I'm gonna, hopefully he should be able to talk now.
Yeah, and I actually can't see the questions in the Q&A at the moment.
Okay, so if I see any there, I'll be sure to point them out to you. Shannon asked a couple, so I'm going to let him start, and then we'll see what comes in.
Hi, Len. I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
We can, Shannon.
Ah, great. So, Len, I really appreciate the manifesto, and I really appreciate the ideas about involving a team. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on converting a skeptical stakeholder, because that's something I run into frequently.
Yeah, I mean, to I guess engage like skeptical stakeholders. I mean, that's really where impact and transparency, I think, are really critical. When I talk about designing upfront to have a project where the skeptical stakeholder is not part of the kickoff, where that stakeholder isn't bought into the objective, isn't bought into the measurement, and ultimately how that output will be presented, is likely to keep them unchanged. And we've seen internally and with our customers that just like the inclusion and the transparency is really effective for, I guess, like increasing reliance on data to make decisions. Does that answer your question, Shannon?
It does, and I guess I have a kind of a related question. Another issue that I sometimes run into, and you addressed just a little bit, but frequently the audience that's receiving the results of the analysis, the data project, they have differing levels of data literacy. So some will want to dive deep into the outputs of the model and the statistical relevance, and others are going to only care about the business question or the research question at hand. How do you manage that difference in an audience?
Yeah, I mean, again, like being very thoughtful at the onset of a project and like transparency. Like to me, what transparency means is, not just like committing the objective and the methodology to paper, but it means like along the journey from the beginning of a project to the end of a project to kind of just show your work so that, when the skeptic or the person that really wants to like review the methodology in detail, like sees the final output, the model or a visualization, they can double click into the source and they can see like the underlying data from that source. And then, if they want, they can double click even deeper and they can go from kind of the final data informing the output to conclusion, and they can see what was the journey from the raw underlying data to that, like the final step. What were the qualitative and the analytical questions that were asked, some of which likely won't yield results, but were part of that process. And we've really seen that when people are able to reproduce an outcome, that like they're more likely to rely on the results, but they also actually need confidence that the results can be relied upon because they can see that whole.
Hey, Len, you mind if I chime in with a little bit of extra context? Yeah, thank you. Hey, Shannon, those are some great questions. And just to provide a little bit of extra context, when we were working on the manifesto and afterwards, we've had a lot of discussion around your two questions, which are relatively related under the kind of overarching banner of inclusion, right? So in terms of converting a skeptical stakeholder, we felt it was very important as we're discussing things to have people from kind of all levels of the data science workflow, right? Whether it's the low-level data scientists or business analysts or whoever, all the way up to decision makers and whatnot included in this process. And I think we've all been, as data folk, involved in a project that became this, a terrible quagmire, right? And the fastest way that we've found to convert some of these skeptical stakeholders is just to say, look, when it went bad, what went bad? And then you can start pointing to things in the manifesto and the exercises that are like, yes, these are specifically designed for you to circumvent those kinds of things. Most specifically, I like the principle talking about clearly identifying questions and objectives that drive the project. Being able to know what's the goal when you start, but more than that, how to declare success. So that it doesn't become this never-ending kind of, oh, what about this and what about that kind of thing. And I think the clarity and direction aspect of the manifesto and just the approach to data teamwork has been something that people can really latch onto. And then in terms of further inclusion, especially as you go up and down the levels of data literacy, that's where we feel like the you say diversity, and I know as soon as I say it, when I'm presenting this to people, I immediately see at least several people cringe, because HR departments the world over have made diversity this thing to be afraid of. And we feel like the idea of diversity travels beyond just the participants, but in the, kind of breadth of the data that you include on the front end, but as well as the outputs, right? You want kind of this diversity of output because different people consume data and learn in different ways. So whether it's a visual output for the people that, like the graphs and charts and pretty pictures, or whether it's the, raw data for somebody that really likes the numbers and likes to dig in. Those are the kinds of things that, we really emphasize that, look, you need this holistic approach. You need to think about all of the different people that are going to be able to provide value, whether it's a subject matter expert who's not data literate, but can provide you that like invaluable context around a data project, or whether it's the, the data scientist who's going to dig in with, Python or R or something and really be able to tell new stories or enhance the stories that you've already found. So that was kind of the context around kind of these discussions around inclusion and diversity as we kind of progress through the manifesto. But great questions.
That's very helpful, and I'm going to steal the term data folk going forward. Just so you know.
Okay, that is excellent. So I don't see any more questions or raised hands currently, but I actually have a question. So I'm going to ask it real quick, and then that'll give people a chance to think if they have any. So you might have said this at the beginning, but usually at the beginning of a webinar, I'm like trying to make sure the control panels are all in place. So I'm curious about sort of where the exercises came from. Like if people are interested in implementing this, like where they can go to sort of find some more concrete things like what you showed us today. And I think you mentioned the idea of if people use this, reach out to us and tell us about it. What do those next steps look like also?
Patrick, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So the data practice exercises were originally just a first step that we took. We had a lot of discussions with people, and we wanted to make sure that this just wasn't going to be words on a page. We didn't want the idea of virtue signaling or kind of this fire and forget sort of model for the manifesto. We really wanted something that people could latch onto. And some of the impetus for the manifesto was we wanted a data science version of what the Agile manifesto did for development practices. And I think the thing that really was powerful about the Agile manifesto and the whole Agile movement is you saw, hundreds of consultancies crop up all over the place to tell people how to be Agile. And, there was this idea of Scrum Master certification, all of these things that grew up around Agile manifesto. And we wanted the same idea. And so these first couple of exercises that we debuted at South by Southwest were simply a few of us that worked on the manifesto got together and said, let's build kind of a framework and show people how you can do this. And the idea is that these are going to make their way onto the datapractices.org site, but also we want to allow people to contribute back. If they have exercises that they would like to propose, or they would like to help us evolve the ones that are on the site, this is going to be a very collaborative model going forward. So I wouldn't think of the exercises that Len was showing as exhaustive, merely a tester teaser to show kind of what's coming, because we don't want to stop at words on a page.
And one thing I'll add to what Patrick said, like a lot of the speaker notes that will be included would be the guide that you would use when taking your organization through this. Like the specific instructions that you would give to participants. And there were a few slides that I removed for this presentation. Just when I've been thinking about time, this went a little faster than I thought, but that did a little bit more examples of how participants would complete the exercise. It's similar to what I did when I gave the example about the head of marketing and her values, concerns, and questions.
Great. Okay, that is perfect. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of questions. I don't see anything else in here. Just want to make sure I'm not missing any of the windows. Okay. So with that, I will say, thank you, Len, for agreeing to do the talk and for bringing Patrick on board. And it's been a great presentation. We really appreciate your time and the time of everybody that attended today. We did record, so this will be available. If you're in the presentation or you registered for it, you'll get a recording. So that'll be coming your way in a little bit. And for those of you in the audience, remember we do DataBytes every month. Our next session will be on May 2nd, and we look forward to seeing everybody then. Thanks. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for joining, everyone.